In our last video, we learned how to add and subtract integers. As we learned in our video about negative numbers, the negative numbers are like a mirror image of the positive numbers on the number line. Each number on the positive side has a negative counterpart on the negative side. There's a 2 on the positive side, and there's a negative 2 on the negative side. There's a 5 on the positive side, and there's a negative 5 on the negative side, and so on. Realizing that can help us understand that negative numbers are just like positive numbers, but they have a negative factor built into them. For example, think about the number 3 for a minute. Do you remember when we learned about factors? We learned that 1 is always a factor of any number. And that's because multiplying by 1 doesn't change a number. 3 and 1 times 3 are the same value. So if you have the number 3, you can factor out a 1 and you have 1 times 3. On the other hand, what if you have negative 3 instead? We could still factor out a 1 from it and nothing would change. You'd have 1 times negative 3. But because the number's negative, we could also factor out a negative 1. Doing that would give us negative 1 times 3. So one way to think about negative numbers is to imagine that they're just like positive numbers, but they always have a factor of negative 1 built into them. That means if you want to change a positive number into a negative number, all you have to do is multiply it by a factor of negative 1. 5 times negative 1 is negative 5. 7 times negative 1 is negative 7. 10 times negative 1 is negative 10, and so on. And one way to visualize this is to see that multiplying by a factor of negative 1 just switches a number from the positive side of the number line to the negative side. But that raises an interesting question. What happens if you multiply a number that's already on the negative side by a factor of negative 1? Like negative 1 times negative 3. Is that going to make it extra negative? Nope. In fact, it's going to do just the opposite. Multiplying a negative number by another negative factor is actually going to switch the answer back to the positive side of the number line. Multiplying by negative 1 acts like a switch no matter which side of the number line you start on. If you start with a positive, then multiplying by negative 1 switches it to negative. But if you start with a negative, multiplying by negative 1 switches it back to positive. And you can keep switching back and forth between the positive and negative side of the number line by multiplying by another negative 1 as many times as you want.
Positive, negative, positive, negative, positive, negative.
So, multiplying by 1 negative gives us a negative. Multiplying by 2 negatives gives us a positive. Multiplying by 3 negatives gives us a negative. Multiplying by 4 negatives gives us a positive. Multiplying by 5 negatives gives us a negative. Multiplying by 6 negatives gives us a positive, and so on. Do you see the pattern? In a multiplication problem, if you have an even number of negative factors, they'll form pairs that will balance each other out and will give you a positive answer. That's because the pair negative 1 times negative 1 just equals 1, which has no effect on the answer. But if you have an odd number of negative factors that are being multiplied together, after you balance out all the pairs, there will always be one negative factor left over that will give you a negative answer. In a minute, we'll see some examples of how knowing this will help us when multiplying and dividing lots of integers. But first, let's look at the simple problem 3 times 5. We know that the answer is 15, but now, thanks to negative numbers, we know that there's 3 more variations of this problem that we need to learn how to do. This might seem a little complicated, but it's really not. That's because we're going to get the same number for the answer for all 4 problems. It's just that the sign of the answer, whether it's positive or negative, will be different depending on how many negative factors we're multiplying. Basically, when doing integer multiplication and division, you can just pretend that the negatives aren't there while you multiply or divide. And then, you count up how many negative factors you have to figure out the sign of the answer. If there's an even number of negative factors, the answer will be positive. But if there's an odd number of negative factors, then the answer will be negative. So, in the first problem, we don't have any negative factors. So our answer is just going to be positive 15, which we already knew. In the second problem, we have only one negative factor being multiplied, which means our answer will be negative 15. In the third problem, we also have just one negative factor, which means that our answer will also be negative 15. And in the fourth problem, we have two negative factors being multiplied. That's an even number of negative factors, so they'll balance each other out, they'll switch and switch back, and they'll give us an answer of positive 15. That's pretty easy, right? All the multiplication and division works the same. It's just that you have to figure out whether the answer is going to be positive or negative. And to do that, all you have to do is figure out if you have an even or an odd number of negative factors in the multiplication or division. If there's an odd number of negative factors, then the answer will be negative. And if there's an even number of negative factors, the answer will be positive. And remember, this process only works for integer multiplication and division. If you have a problem that also contains integer addition and subtraction, you need to do those operations using the rules we learned in the last video.
Okay, hello guys. We're going to work with this example before making the exercises that you have to do. So let's see this. Calculate the following. Here on this example we're having negative 51 times 16. So the 51 is negative and the 16 is positive. What does that mean? That means that we're having there just one negative, and according to the rules that we already wrote, when we have different sign, we're going to copy as answer a negative sign. So what will be the solution? So we're going to multiply just 51 times 16, and we're going to have the negative. So let's see. Once you multiply that, you're going to get 816. Now you're having just here between those numbers just one negative, so you're going to have here a negative answer. Remember that when you have just one negative, the answer will be negative. Let's see the second exercise, the second example. 27 times negative 18. So we're having just one negative sign. That means that our solution will be negative. 27 times 18 will be 486, and just because we're having only one negative, we're going to write here just negative. Now let's go to that one. Negative 96 times negative 26. Now we're having two negative, so that means that our solution will be positive. To negative, make a positive solution. Knowing that, we're going to multiply just 95 times 26, and it will be 2,470. And we're going to leave it like that because our numbers are both are negative. So we're going to get here a positive solution. And the last one, we're having 0 times negative 72. 0 times 72 will be 0. And it doesn't matter how smaller can be this number or how larger can be this number. If we multiply any number by 0, the answer will be always 0. So here we're going to have 0. Okay, now I will give you time to copy that. Okay, now let's solve those exercises or those examples, and we're going to work with them in a quick way because we're using small numbers. Now let's see. we're having here 3 times negative 5, so our solution will be 3 times 5 is 15. We're just having one negative, so the solution will be negative. Now 4 times negative 1, 4 times 1 is 4. We're having just one negative, so our solution will be negative. Now the next one is 2 times negative 3 times negative 2, so we're going to multiply just the number. 2 times 3 is 6, 6 times 2 is 12, and we're having there just two negative numbers, so our solution will be positive. Now negative 3 times negative 6 times negative 1, so we're going to multiply just the number. 3 times 6 is 18, 18 times 1 is still being 18. Now we're having here 1, 2, 3 negative, so our solution will be negative. The next one, negative 3 times negative 6 times 1, so we're going to multiply just the number. 3 times 6 times 1 will be 18. Now how many negative signs do we have? We're having 1, 2, so our solution will be positive. Now the next one, 2 times 4 times negative 1, we're going to multiply just the number. 2 times 4 is 8, 8 times 1 is still being 8. And how many negative signs do we have? 1. So we're going to have here a negative. And the last one, negative 2 times 4 times negative 1, we're going to multiply just the number. 2 times 4 is 8, 8 times 1 is still being 8. And we're going to count how many negative signs do we have. And we're having here 1, 2, so our solution will be positive. Now I will give you time to copy. Okay, now let's say that you forget all what you have learned today and you want to multiply, so how you're going to word the signs. So there is a tip, and we're going to start saying this in a very daily life way. The first one, we're going to say that the enemy of your friend will be what? The enemy of your friend will be your enemy. Now let's see. The friend of your enemy will be what? Your enemy. Now, the enemy of your enemy will be, of course, your friend. And the last one, the friend of your friend will be your friend. So in this way we can remember the rules of multiplication. Again, the enemy of your friend will be your enemy. The friend of your enemy will be your enemy. The enemy of your enemy will be your friend, and the friend of your friend will be your friend.